The wind was a blade against the plains, honed on 1,000 miles of frozen earth. It found every crack in the small cabin where Alara lived, whispering cruelties her late husband's memory could no longer shout down. Grief had scoured her hollow, but it was the silence that was truly eating her away, a silence punctuated only by the groaning of timbers and the gnawing of her own fear. Today, that groaning had become a shriek, then a splintering crash. The north section of the barn roof had finally surrendered to the weight of a merciless winter. She stood before the ruin, a shawl pulled tight around shoulders that felt too frail to carry the burden of her own name. Inside the crippled structure, her 2 remaining cows and a handful of chickens huddled against the far wall, their breath pluming in the frigid air now open to the sky. They were all she had left. They were her slender tether to a life that felt determined to cast her adrift. Desperation, cold and sharp as an icicle, pierced through the numbness of her sorrow. She could not lose them. Alara saw the world in shadows now, the nuances that loud, bustling people overlooked. She saw the way Mr. Henderson, the town banker, watched her land, his gaze not sympathetic but covetous, like a coyote eyeing a weakened lamb. She saw the pity in the eyes of the other women, a brittle kindness that would shatter the moment she asked for anything real. They saw a widow to be managed, a problem to be solved with casseroles and platitudes. They did not see the iron spine forming in the crucible of her solitude. They did not understand that her quiet was not emptiness, but a space where observation took root. With hands raw from the cold, she tried to salvage what she could. She dragged splintered planks, her muscles screaming in protest. A heavy beam, slick with frost, slipped from her grasp, crashing down and pinning her hand against a post. A cry, thin and sharp, was stolen by the wind. She wrenched her hand free, blood welling dark and immediate against the pale skin of her knuckles. Pain flared up her arm, a white-hot fury. She sank to her knees in the snow, cradling her throbbing hand, the sight of the gaping hole in the roof blurring through a sudden, hopeless film of tears. The land was taking everything. The sky was a vast, indifferent witness, and she was utterly, terrifyingly alone. It was in this moment of absolute despair that a different kind of shadow fell over her. It was not the fleeting shade of a cloud, but the solid presence of a man. He stood at the edge of her property line, a tall, gaunt figure stark against the unforgiving white of the landscape. Silas. The town whispered his name like a curse. A man haunted by the war, they said. A man who had come back with a silence far deeper and more unsettling than her own. He lived in the tumble-down cabin at the farthest edge of the valley, a place people avoided, as if his ghosts might be contagious. He simply stood there, watching. His face was unreadable from this distance, a study in angles and stillness. Fear, sharp and primal, warred with her exhaustion. She had nothing left to steal, yet his presence felt like a final, impending loss. He took a slow step forward, his worn boots crunching in the snow, and the sound was like the turning of a page to the last chapter of her life. He did not offer a greeting, no empty words of comfort the townsfolk would have dispensed. His gaze moved from her, to her injured hand, to the catastrophic wound in the barn roof. The assessment was swift, silent, and complete. Alara flinched when he moved closer, expecting. She wasn't sure what. Accusation? A demand? Instead, he walked past her directly to the barn, his movements economical and deliberate. He ran a hand over a supporting beam that still stood, testing its integrity. He looked up at the jagged opening to the sky, his eyes squinting against the flat, gray light, reading the geometry of the collapse. For a long time, he did nothing but look. Alara remained on her knees, the cold seeping into her bones, her hand a pulsing knot of pain. She watched him, this man who was more rumor than person. She saw the set of his shoulders, not with the lazy posture of a drifter, but the rigid discipline of someone who had learned to carry immense weight. She saw the calluses on his hands when he finally lowered them, the deep lines etched around his eyes. These were not the shadows of malice, she realized, but of history, of things seen and endured. Her own quiet had taught her to recognize the language of other silences. His was not empty. It was full of unsaid things, a fortress built around a wound. Without a word, he turned and walked away, back toward his own desolate property. A bitter laugh almost escaped Alara's lips. Of course, he had come only to look, to witness her failure like everyone else. She pushed herself to her feet, a fresh wave of despair washing over her. But then he reappeared, a dark shape cresting the hill. He was carrying a heavy canvas roll, a toolbox, and an axe. He walked back to the barn, dropped the tools with a muffled thud in the snow, and began to work. He moved with a grim, relentless efficiency. The rhythmic thud of his axe echoed in the frozen air as he cleared the broken timbers. He worked without pause, his breath misting and freezing in his beard. Alara, stunned into stillness, finally retreated to her cabin. She bandaged her hand as best she could, her fingers clumsy and stiff. Through the small window she watched him. He was a force of nature unto himself, a solitary man pitting his strength against the wreckage. There was no request for payment, no negotiation. There was only the work. Hesitantly, she stoked her stove and heated a thin broth. Carrying the steaming mug, she walked back out to the barn. She approached him slowly, as one might approach a wary animal. She held out the mug. He stopped, his axe mid-swing, and looked at her. For the first time, their eyes met directly. His were the color of a winter sky just before a storm, a deep, troubled gray. There was no warmth in them, but there was no cruelty either. There was just a profound, soul-deep weariness. He took the mug from her, his calloused fingers brushing against hers. He drank it down in 3 long swallows, the warmth a fleeting comfort against the pervasive cold. He handed the empty mug back, gave a single, curt nod, and returned to his work. This became their ritual for the next 4 days. Each morning, he would appear as the weak sun bled over the horizon. He scavenged usable timber from the collapse, reinforcing what he could, and felling 2 lean pines from the woodlot behind her property to serve as new central beams. He worked with a furious, focused energy, as if the physical labor could exorcise the demons that rode him. Alara, in turn, became his silent quartermaster. She brought him broth, then bread and salted pork. She refilled his water skin. She cleaned and rebandaged her own hand, the injury a small physical echo of the larger ruin he was mending. She learned the contours of his silence. She saw how he paused when a flock of birds took flight suddenly, his body tensing, his hand drifting to his hip where a gun was not. She noticed he always worked with his back to the open plains, preferring to face the treeline, as if expecting a threat from the empty spaces. These were the shadows she read, the silent testament to a past that held him captive. And in her quiet tending, her unobtrusive presence, he seemed to find a sliver of peace. He began to leave a small pile of chopped firewood on her porch before he left each evening. He rehung a gate that had sagged on its hinges. These were his sentences, his paragraphs, his entire vocabulary of connection. They were building something more than a roof. They were laying the foundation of a trust so fragile it could only exist in the absence of words. One afternoon, as he hoisted the main beam into place, she saw a flicker of something in his face as he looked at the repaired structure. Not pride, but a deep, quiet satisfaction. He had restored order to a piece of the world. It was a small victory, but in a life like his, she suspected small victories were all one could hope for. On the 5th day, with the roof framed and nearly sheathed, a new shadow fell across the snow. This one was cast by a polished buggy, and it belonged to Mr. Henderson, the banker. He was not alone. 2 hard-faced men, strangers to the valley, sat beside him. Henderson climbed down, his fine wool coat a stark, arrogant blot against the homestead's poverty. He surveyed the repairs with a pinched expression, his eyes lingering on Silas with open disdain. "Well, Mrs. Davies," Henderson began, his voice oozing a condescending sympathy that set Alara's teeth on edge. "I see you found some help." He dismissed Silas with a flick of his eyes, as if he were no different from a stray dog she'd taken in. Alara said nothing, simply pulling her shawl tighter. Her silence seemed to embolden him. It's a valiant effort, truly, but I'm afraid it's too late. I've come about the loan. Your late husband's note is past due. Severely. The extension, Alara said, her voice quiet but clear. You granted me an extension until the spring thaw. Henderson gave a theatrical sigh. Ah yes, about that. Clerical error, I'm afraid. The board reviewed the accounts. Given the state of the property, the depreciation. He gestured vaguely at the half-repaired barn. They've called the note. Effective immediately. I have the foreclosure papers right here. He produced a sheaf of documents from his coat. A death warrant for her life on this land. Silas had stopped working. He stood on the new roof, a hammer in his hand, perfectly still. He watched the scene below, his face an unreadable mask. The two men with Henderson shifted their weight, their hands near their coats. They were here for more than paperwork. That can't be, Alara whispered, the words catching in her throat. All this work, all this struggle, for nothing. I'm a businessman, Alara, not a charity, Henderson said, his tone hardening. The land is worth more than the debt, but it requires a man's hand to make it prosper. I am prepared to be generous. Leave by week's end, and I will forgive the outstanding balance. It was then that Alara's quiet observation transformed into a weapon. During the long, lonely nights, she had read every piece of paper her husband had left behind, searching for answers, for a foothold. She had read the loan agreement countless times, tracing the dense legal script with her finger. She had read its shadows. There is a clause, she said, her voice gaining a strength that surprised even herself. Article 7, subsection B. It states that any act of God, such as catastrophic storm damage, invokes a mandatory 90-day grace period for repayment, provided repairs are undertaken in good faith. Henderson froze, his smug expression faltering. That's an obscure addendum. It hardly applies. It applies, Alara stated, her gaze unwavering. She looked at the new timbers of the roof, at the man standing upon them like a silent guardian. Repairs are being undertaken. A flicker of fury crossed Henderson's face. This is ridiculous. This vagrant's work doesn't constitute a formal repair. He turned to his men. We're taking possession. The two men started forward. But Silas was no longer on the roof. He had moved with a speed that was both silent and shocking, dropping to the ground behind them. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't make a sound. He simply stood there, blocking their path to Alara. His stillness was more menacing than any threat. He held the hammer loosely in one hand, not as a weapon, but as an extension of his will. His storm-gray eyes were fixed on the men, and in them, for the first time, the weariness was gone, replaced by a cold, lethal focus. It was the look of a man who had walked through hell and was unimpressed by its lesser demons. One of the hired men, overconfident, scoffed and reached out to shove Silas aside. The movement that followed was a blur of brutal efficiency. Silas sidestepped, his free hand catching the man's wrist, twisting it at an unnatural angle. A sharp crack, followed by a howl of pain, split the air. The second man, startled, reached for his coat, but Silas was already moving, his other hand striking the man's throat with the heel of his palm. It wasn't a killing blow, but it was precise, dropping the man to his knees, choking and gasping. The entire violent ballet had taken less than 3 seconds. Henderson stared, his face pale with shock and fear. He looked from his incapacitated men to the silent, immovable figure of Silas, and finally to Alara. In her eyes, he no longer saw a fragile widow. He saw the woman who had quoted subsection B. He saw the woman who had the valley's ghost standing as her shield. He scrambled back to his buggy, his greed extinguished by a sudden, urgent need for self-preservation. He hauled his groaning men inside and whipped the horses into a frantic retreat, leaving behind only churned snow and the lingering scent of his fear. The silence that descended in the buggy's wake was different. It was not the oppressive, lonely silence of before. This quiet was a shared space, a territory they now held together. The air vibrated with the aftermath of the confrontation, with the truth of what had passed between them. Silas stood for a moment, the lethal focus slowly draining from his eyes, leaving the familiar weariness in its place. Though it seemed lessened now, its edges softened. He let the hammer fall from his hand, the thud against the packed earth a final, punctuating sound. Alara looked at him, at this man who had mended her home and defended her life, and felt a profound, aching gratitude that no words could possibly contain. He had seen her not as a burden, but as something worth protecting. And she, in turn, had seen past the town's fearful whispers to the core of the man, to the silent honor that guided his actions. He had fought his own battles for so long, alone in the wilderness of his mind. Today, she had given his fight a purpose beyond mere survival. He bent down to retrieve his hammer, his movements slow again, almost gentle. When he straightened, he finally looked at her, his gaze holding hers. The ghosts were still in his eyes. She knew they would always be a part of him, but they had retreated from the foreground. He saw her, the quiet woman who had faced down a thief with a line of text, who had stood her ground not with a shout, but with the unshakable certainty of her knowledge. A flicker of a smile, so faint it was barely there, touched the corner of his mouth. "The roof," he said, his voice rough from disuse, the first words he had spoken to her beyond a nod. "It will hold." Alara nodded, a lump forming in her throat. "I know." The work was done. The threat was gone. They stood together under the vast, indifferent sky, which no longer felt like a witness to her solitude, but a canopy over their shared ground. He had pieced together the broken shelter for her animals, and she, with her quiet understanding, had offered a shelter for his haunted soul. He was a man who spoke in deeds, and she was a woman who listened with her eyes. They had mended each other in the language they both knew best, the profound, articulate, and healing power of silence. The spring thaw was coming, and for the first time since winter had fallen, Alara felt the unmistakable promise of warmth on her face. Together, they turned and walked toward the small, waiting cabin, two solitary figures casting a single, resilient shadow on the snow.